Hello and welcome to this talk. My title is Borderless and Brazen, Black German Feminist Literature since the 1980s. First of all, I would like to say that I'm glad to be here and to speak in this context, and I would like to thank Veronika Schuchter and Miriam Schwarz for the invitation. Well, the first African-German encounters date back as far as the 12th century, and it is known that African communities living in Germany have mobilized against racist structures and colonial rule already for centuries. This paper focuses on what we call the new or modern Black German movement that started in the mid-1980s. As I'm going to show, in 1984, conversations between Afro-German women and the African-American feminist writer Audre Lorde began that led to the publication of the volume Farbe bekennen Afrodeutsche Frauen auf den Spuren ihrer Geschichte, or in English, Showing Our Colors, Afro-German Women Speak Out in 1986. Especially in this context of this lecture, it is interesting to note that the beginnings of what to this day is a multi-layered, large-scale political endeavor was significantly brought forward by a call for literary representation. Part 1. Origin Stories, the Beginning of a Movement. Audre Lorde, the self-identified Black lesbian, mother, warrior, poet, and one of the most popular voices in U.S. American Black feminism, engaged in several transnational projects with Black women and women of color from diasporic communities throughout her lifetime. These projects were motivated by Lorde's idea of a global mythical sisterhood among marginalized women rooted in common experiences at the intersection of racism and sexism. It is in this context that we can understand her time spent in Germany between 1984 and 1992, when Lorde established close communal ties with Black German women in West Germany and became instrumental in helping Black German women's literary expression and community formation on its way. In those days, Lorde entered Germany's cultural and academic scene at a time when physical violence and other forms of discrimination against people of color and immigrants was on the rise. While most white Germans celebrated the reunification of the German nation-state and felt interpellated by the sentiment of unity, the spirit of the time also reconsolidated the discrepancy between the margins and the centers of German society, here conceived of in terms of race and ethnicity. In 1995, Afro-German poet Maya Yim described the mood around unification from the perspective of people of color in her poem Blues in Schwarz-Weiß, Blues in Black and White. Während noch immer und schon wieder die einen verteilt und vertrieben und zerstückelt werden, die einen, die immer die anderen sind und waren und bleiben sollen, erklären sich noch immer und schon wieder die eigentlich anderen zu den einzig wahren, erklären uns noch immer und schon wieder die eigentlich anderen den Krieg. Das wiedervereinigte Deutschland feiert sich wieder 1990, ohne Immigrantinnen, Flüchtlinge, jüdische und schwarze Menschen. Es feiert im intimen Kreis, es feiert in Weiß. Doch es ist ein Blues in Schwarz-Weiß. Es ist ein Blues. In this poem, Maya Yim reminds us that Germany in the aftermath of World War II continued to be invested in ideologies of racial purity and the idea of Germanness as a white ethnic identity. Furthermore, Yim shows that while German reunification is considered a landmark historical event in Germany and beyond, the sentiment coming off of the white German population is nothing new for people of color. Noch immer und schon wieder, still and over again, Yim writes, do processes of othering and exclusion prevail for some, while others seemingly naturally engage in a narrative of unity. As Yim and other German writers of color have shown, the way in which belonging to the German national community is narrated heavily relies on images of kinship and ancestry, which works to exclude those who cannot claim such ties. Whiteness in this case means intimacy with and belonging to a group that is effectively invested in what Sarah Ahmed calls the familiarity of the white world. Unquote. While some are celebrating, others are afraid or grieving and actively and violently excluded from sharing in the celebrations. In an interview, Maya Yim stated that we sensed that the imminent inner German union would be accompanied by an intensified closure towards the outside, an outside which would include us, meaning Black Germans. Highlighting the way in which familial ties imagined as blood relations are essential to the construction of German citizenship, Black German activist and historian Fatima El-Tayeb notes that, quote, the idea that nationality is not connected to place of birth or culture, but rather to a national essence that is somehow incorporated in the subject's blood, has been strong in Germany since the early 19th century and has been especially decisive for the country's 20th century history, unquote. By invoking the idea of a national essence, Althea points towards the interrelatedness of consanguinity and the construction and naturalization of race as an ideology of human gradation. This essence, as it were, cannot be acquired through cultural assimilation, but can only be passed on like genetic material. Therefore, the very idea of this essence, as mythological as it might be, is a powerful binding agent that hails people who have otherwise nothing in common as part of a community where certain emotions, interests, and values are shared. Consequently, this image of national belonging as familial belonging invokes the idea of a shared genealogy through which certain traits and attributes are passed down. In queer phenomenology, orientations, objects, others, Sarah Ahmed points out that it is precisely through this idea of passing down traits and attributes that the familial and the racial become discursively intertwined. Quote, race extends the family form. Other members of the race are like a family, just as the family is defined in racial terms. The analogy works powerfully to produce a particular version of race and a particular version of family predicated on likeness, where likeness becomes a matter of shared attributes, unquote. It is precisely this emphasis on likeness in the discursive formations of family and race, paired with Enlightenment concepts of Eurocentrism and white racial superiority, that has led to the alignment of German national identity with racial or ethnic identity. In her work Becoming Black, African-American Black diaspora scholar Michelle Wright points out that these German historical and cultural discourses have produced a marginalization for Black Germans which can be considered unique within the Western Hemisphere. Black people and the history of their presence in Germany through colonialism, military encounters in the wake of both world wars, as well as foreign policies and immigration in East and West Germany, are integral parts of how the German nation-state constituted itself, to which many of them are related by residency, passport, genealogy, or education. At the same time, their skin color becomes a trait that perpetually marks them as other to the German nation-state. Mostly misrecognized as foreigners, Black Germans are imagined to belong elsewhere, outside of Germany, outside of Europe, in a not further specified place called Africa, that in its invocation here is suffused by white, discriminatory, and oversimplified ideas. It is not only this misconception, but the utter denial of a Black German subject position that renders the formation of an identity that is based on both being Black and being German utterly complicated. While whiteness is thus established and perpetuated as a universalized neutral subject position belonging in the West, Black Germans' bodies are read as out of place and as forever, quote, just arriving, or as Norma Huber calls it, space invaders. In a positive, empowered way, invading or claiming space is a motto that is inextricably intertwined with the publication of the volume Farbe bekennen, Afrodeutsche Frauen auf den Spuren ihrer Geschichte, Showing Our Colors, Black German Women Speak Out, which I've mentioned before. During her time in Germany, Audre Lorde led writing workshops at the Freie Universität Berlin where she got to know Black German women. As a well-known professional writer, Lorde sided with Black German women who recognized the importance and necessity for marginalized communities to participate in literary production. Literature here not only serves as a medium where shared experiences can be articulated, but also be broadly communicated. Black German women's literature can therefore be seen as an important step towards community formation. Farbe bekennen, consisting of autobiographical accounts by various generations of Black German women, as well as Maya Yim's master's thesis on the history of the Black presence in Germany, helped to translate disconnected individual experiences into a collective one. While Black Germans cannot trace their presence in Germany to one common particular historical event, efforts at community formation can be considered politically motivated and intentional. It is also important to note that the experiences of Black Germans are also shaped by post-unification histories. Black German activist and scholar Peggy Piesche has to be mentioned here, who has produced a substantial body of work on narrating and theorizing the experience of Black Germans in the former GDR, highlighting that, quote, apart from the troubling fact that the GDR is treated as an isolated historical unit, seldom juxtaposed to West Germany, of most significance for the direction of those arguments is their insistence on portraying the GDR as a homogeneous white society, unquote. Before the onset of the Black German movement, many Black Germans lived in isolation from each other. Until the coinage of the term Afro-German by Audre Lorde, together with a group of Afro-German women in 1984, there was hardly any positive terminology to refer to Black people in Germany. Hence, there was also hardly any way to conceive of oneself or each other in a positive light. The stories compiled in Showing Our Colors therefore describes the difficulties and hardships of living in Germany as a Black woman, but they also reveal interesting and challenging life stories, accomplishments, and resilience. Furthermore, the term Afro-German, which since the 1990s has largely been replaced by Black German, links to Afro-American, which, however, by the time Afro-German came into use, had already been replaced by African American. What is important about the prefix Afro, though, is the positive connotation it bears through its connection to the Black Power movement and Black Pride, as well as its universality that points towards a mode of being in the world that is informed by being of African descent. Beyond that, the term Afro-German places Black Germans in community with other Black communities in the West and thus helps to think Black experience transnationally. Following from the publication of Showing Our Colors, a range of texts by Black German authors of various gender identities have been published where autobiographical writing and poetry emerge as the predominant forms of literary expression. Like Showing Our Colors, to this day, lots of books by Black Germans are published by Orlando, a feminist publishing house that is based in Berlin, and which was the first German publishing house to publish German translations of Audre Lorde's text. The second part is called Uncovering Forgotten Her Stories. In the foreword to the English edition of Farbe Bekennen, Showing Our Colors, Audre Lorde asks, quote, who are they, these women of the diaspora, beyond the details of our particular oppressions, although certainly not outside the reference of those details? Where do our paths intersect as women of color, and where do our paths diverge? Most important, what can be learned from our connected difference that will be useful to us both, Afro-German and Afro-American, unquote. Here, Lorde points towards the concerns and characteristics of Black German feminist literature, some of which I will address in this lecture. For one, the quote not only speaks to Black German women's self-identification, rather it bespeaks a sense of self that firmly situates them as subjects of what is commonly referred to as the Black or African diaspora. For another, Audre Lorde asks, quote, who are they, these women of the Black diaspora? In so doing, she points towards the fact that there is a learning process involved and that at that point in time, there was hardly any information out there that could deliver a satisfying answer to the question. Wondering how the experiential horizons of African American and Black German women might diverge as well as intersect, Lorde speaks to the diversity of experiences comprised by the framework of diaspora that are brought about by location-specific circumstances, as well as by how individuals are related to this concept with their subject positions. The term diaspora in itself has an ancient meaning as it describes, quote, displaced communities of people who have been dislocated from their native homeland through movements of migration, immigration, or exile, unquote. Etymologically, the term derives from the Greek term diasporian, which consists of the terms dia, which means across, and sperian, which means to sow or scatter. While the term was initially used to describe the dispersal of Jewish people from their homeland, it also proved relevant to describe the largely involuntary, but also the voluntary dispersal of people of African descent across the Western Hemisphere. As such, the term was redirected from its initial religious connotation and has spurred a vast array of scholarship in fields such as sociology, literary studies, and or queer and ethnic studies since the 1990s. As one of the landmark books of this era, Paul Gilroy's The Black Atlantic of 1993 has to be mentioned, in which he highlights the refashioning of former routes of the transatlantic slave trade by Black diasporic subjects as routes of cultural exchange. However, while his account proves useful to explain the way in which Black subjects in the West make meaning of historical trauma, the frameworks focus on the Atlantic and thus on the Middle Passage as the constitutive moment of the Black diaspora, privileges the communities that have access to this narrative, but renders invisible Black presences and experiences in the West that do not trace their origin to the space-time of the transatlantic trade of enslaved people. Therefore, in her article, Middle Passage Blackness and its Discontents, The Case for Post-War Epistemology, Mitchell Wright suggests that, quote, there are other epistemologies that do allow for the exploration of Black agency in a complex, diverse relationship different Black collectives have to one another, as well as to white collectives and white nation-states, unquote. She therefore proposes the time frame of the Second World War as a nodal point for analyzing the Black diasporic movements in the 20th century, thus allowing for the atrocities committed by European colonial powers as well as subsequent Black dispersal and voluntary and involuntary migration to become visible. For Wright, the starting point of the Second World War therefore becomes fluent. She proposes that the Second World War can be understood as, quote, the inevitable sequence to the deeply asymmetrical power relations left in Europe at the suspension of hostilities in 1918, unquote, which opens up the possibility to include European colonial endeavors on the African continent between 1881 and 1914 into the world-making processes leading up to and following the unspeakable atrocities committed throughout the actual war years. She furthermore contends that while the Middle Passage epistemology emerges as a linear progress narrative from bondage to freedom, it privileges masculine-centered heteronormative perspectives that mostly center the African American community and thus to a certain extent reinscribe a particular, albeit underprivileged, notion of nationalism. Mobilizing a similar line of argumentation in her book European Others, Queering Ethnicity in Post-National Europe, Fatima Al-Tayyab points out that diasporic communities challenge this concept of the nation-state as, quote, their transnational affiliations make them something different from either insiders or outsiders, unquote, and thus bridging the binary between discourses on diaspora and migration. Al-Tayyab suggests that, quote, diaspora transcends the binary of citizen and foreigner, the linear model of movement from origin to destination. What diaspora signifies is the fact of change, of losing a purity that one never had, thus providing the basis for a situational community of racialized subjects engaged in the process of queering ethnicity, unquote. In her approach to conceptualizing diasporic consciousness, Al-Tayyab uses the word queer as a verb that indicates, quote, using the tension of living supposedly exclusive identities and transforming it into creative potential, building a community based on the shared experience of multiple, contradictory positionalities, unquote. As such, activism by queer and or Black German women has to be understood as vital to the formation of the Black German community and the emergence of Black German literature. As scholar, activist, and co-organizer of the Black German movement, Maisha Aouma notes in her article, Knowledges of Unbelonging, Epistemic Change as a Defining Mode for Black Women's Activism in Germany, quote, the Black women's movement is the site within which issues of scholarship on Black Germany, belonging, and the relationship to the state are mainly situated, unquote. When Black German women activists came up in the political scene of the predominantly white women's movement, they began to highlight their experiences at the intersections of racism and heterosexism, while engaging in redefining and adding to feminist theories and politics. As mentioned before, the publication of Showing Our Colors and the publication's origin in Black queer feminist transnational exchange testifies to the centrality of Black and or queer women's voices in the politicization of the Black German movement. Through autobiographical writing and poetry, Black German women authors, quote, inscribed Black and female perspectives into the German language, unquote, and spoke out about experiences constitutive to the makeup of German society that were heretofore rendered invisible. One of the major early contributors to this endeavor was indubitably the Black German poet Maya Yim, who, as a co-founder of the Initiative for Black People in Germany and co-editor and author of Farbe bekennen, occupies an important role in the history of the movement, as well as within the emergence of Black German literature. Before her untimely death in 1996, Maya Yim published the volume Blues in Schwarz-Weiß, Blues in Black and White, and another collection of poetry called Nachtgesang, Night Song, was published posthumously. In her poetry, she skillfully, elegantly, and innovatively utilizes the German language, mixed with Ghanaian Adinkra symbolism and Black poetic conventions, such as blues poetry, to formulate powerful poetic commentary about collective social-political realities as well as personal experiences. Likewise, it is important to note that the community organizations that have started in the mid-1980s are not the absolute starting point of the modern or new Black German community formation. For example, in the late 1970s, a group of Black women already emerged around the poet Guy Nzinga Saint-Louis, who got together to swap experiences and to become politically active. As revealed in an interview with a woman identified as Nadu, published in Natasha Kelly's volume in connection with the film Millie's Awakening, this group had also already planned to publish a book. These efforts at community building, however, were rendered difficult because of economic and educational asymmetries between emerging Black German women activists and white German feminists, as well as a lack of acknowledgement towards the Black German women's perspective, and last but not least, a lack of resources. And yet, this group of Black German women can still be considered politically important, and that it was one of the first post-World War II attempts to formulate ideas about Black German women's identity. Furthermore, Guy Nzinga Saint-Louis' poetry volume, Gedichte einer schönen Frau, Poems of a Beautiful Woman, published in 1983 and standing out for its focus on queer sexuality, can be considered an important stepping stone towards, quote, opening up a substantial field in which intense discussions ensued about the challenges and possibilities of anti-heteronormative self-definitions, self-concepts, and self-designs, unquote. Another text that I would like to mention and engage with in more depth is Ika Hügel-Marschall's autobiography Daheim unterwegs, ein deutsches Leben of 1998, and it was translated as Invisible Woman Growing Up Black in Germany in 2001. Also one of the co-founders of the Black German women's movement, Hügel-Marschall relays her experiences of growing up in Germany, the relevance of transnational identification, as well as the problems and possibilities for Black German discourses of belonging vis-à-vis the concept of citizenship. This third and second to last part of my lecture is called At Home on the Way. Born to white German mother and an African-American father in Germany in 1946, Hügel-Marschall's protagonist Ika is depicted as she comes to grips with national and cultural unbelonging. At the age of 6, Ika was torn out of her familial environment at the behest of German youth services and grew up separated from her maternal home in a children's home. This biographical history is one that Hügel-Marschall shares with quite a few Black Germans born in the immediate post-war years, as German officials considered the mixed-race children of the occupation era what she calls a humanitarian problem. Buying into an anti-Black racist logic, these children were made out as too foreign for a life in Germany. Many of them were therefore taken out of their birth families to grow up in children's homes, and some were even given up for adoption in the United States so as to align with their real racial community. Growing up Black in Germany for Ika therefore meant growing up in isolation. Even though she lived with her white German mother's family during the first 5 years of her life, Ika is never identified as German due to her skin color, since Germanness is intrinsically marked as white. She is exposed to German racist slurs from early childhood on and is constantly given the status of an outsider in German society. Es gab nur eine Welt, die weiße Welt, in die ich hineingeboren worden war. Eine schwarze Welt existierte nicht und es gab nur eine Wirklichkeit, nur eine Wahrheit. Es gab keinen schwarzen Vater, keine schwarze Großmutter, keine schwarzen Geschwister, andere schwarze Kinder oder schwarze Nachbarn in meiner Welt. Because of her skin color, Ika was constantly made to feel out of place in Germany. The description of her surroundings shows German society as predominantly white. Black skin color, then, is conceived of as a sign of unbelonging, the trait that immediately positions the individual of color outside of the nation. As Sarah Ahmed explains, quote, "The alignment of race and space is crucial to how they materialize as givens. In other words, while the other side of the world is associated with racial otherness, racial others become associated with the other side of the world." With regards to children of mixed racial heritage growing up in Germany after World War II, this was equally true. Blackness was imagined as not existing within the confines of the German nation state, as the space of that state is essentially defined by whiteness. Therefore, whiteness becomes the normative point of orientation for all other ethnic identities and determines who belongs and does not belong to that space. Growing up as a child of mixed racial heritage in this cultural framework, Ika is defined by all that she is not. She is not recognized as German due to her lack of whiteness, and is therefore associated with a distant space, alluding to her African American father's cultural location, to which she has no access during the first 46 years of her life. These structures also affect her family life and render her relations with her mother equally complicated. At the age of 6, Ika is taken away from her familial home and from then on spends her childhood in a children's home. Even though Ika acknowledges that her mother was powerless towards her institutionalization, Ika shows that the only familial and cultural ties she has are to her white mother, and that her trust in her mother was shaken through this experience of exclusion, and her sense of home was disrupted. The familial home, which is usually considered a space of belonging by birthright, was no longer available to her, as she was perceived as an other to white German society. This society assigned a new space to her, the children's home, where her otherness could be policed. On the other hand, Ika acknowledges that her mother was affected by the racism directed at her black daughter, since because of having Ika, she was, quote, "verspottet, verachtet und aus der Gesellschaft ausgeschlossen," unquote. Separating the white mothers from their black children might also be seen as an attempt at artificially cutting off the genealogical ties between the white mother and the black daughter, and hence undoing the genealogical ties between Germanness and any claims the black daughter may make on its associated whiteness. Ika encounters many difficulties in life, but still manages to pursue higher education. She achieves a degree in social pedagogy and becomes politically active within the Black feminist movement. She is nowadays considered an important Black German activist and writer. When Ika encountered other Afro-German women and became one of the founding figures of the Black German movement, she develops a sense of belonging. It seems that through the presence of other Black Germans and their community-building activities, Ika is given the chance to embrace Germany not only as her birthplace, but also as a space where she can be both Black and German. During early adulthood in the 1980s, she comes into contact with Audre Lorde and also travels to the United States for the first time. Ika recalls, "Noch während ich meine ersten Schritte auf dem Flughafen mache, grüßen mich einige Schwarze und ich weiß nicht recht, wie ich darauf reagieren soll. In meiner Heimat grüßen sich nur die Menschen, die sich kennen oder die sich irgendwo bei irgendwem schon einmal begegnet sind. Diese Freundlichkeit und die Wahrnehmung meiner Person sowie die unausgesprochene Verbundenheit mit schwarzen Menschen berühren mich genau an der Stelle, wo die Sehnsucht nach Zugehörigkeit und Erlösung sitzt." Unquote. The greetings that Black Americans extended to her at the airport can be considered an acknowledgement and invitation into a larger community and immediately provides her with a feeling of familiarity. This is another yet very different illustration from what I've shown in the beginning, where community can be read as a form of extended family. With regards to that, another aspect in the narrative that points in a similar direction is her reunion with her biological father. In addition to the transnational connections that Ika has formed throughout her life until this point in the narrative with other black women, it is through her father that she obtains U.S. citizenship. However, one of the many powerful aspects of this narrative is the way in which Hugo Marshall juxtaposes, connects, and then suspends the relationality between her yearning to meet her father, traveling to the US and actually finding him, ultimately even attaining legal permission to take up residence in the US and her conscious decision to live her life in Germany after all. While Ika's visits to the United States put her experiences of unbelonging and isolation in perspective, it is the desire to not trade one place of origin for another that provides her with the fabric to create a sense of belonging that exists beyond dominant notions of kinship, citizenship, and geographical confines. This last part is called Conclusion: Black German Literature in the Present. In this talk, I have delineated the beginnings of what can be referred to as Black German feminist literature, as well as their conceptual and political concerns. As I've shown, the emergence of Black German feminist literature is inextricably intertwined with Black German community formation and mirrors personal and collective histories of a variety of differently positioned women in Germany, as well as their social-political relationships with each other, the Black community on a larger scale, German mainstream society red-white, and ultimately the state by way of negotiating the value and status of citizenship. While this survey is by no means exhaustive, as it does not breach on the invaluable contributions by male-identified Black Germans, plus the fact that Black German literary productions have become so numerous and diverse in genre, approach, and authorship, that it would be hubris to make any attempts or claims towards completion at this point. Suffice it to say, however, that within the last 30 years, Black Germans have produced a dearth of literary texts that have added to, expanded on, and revised the literary works at the origin of the Black German movement. In the closing, I would like to mention another 4 publications that I consider integral to the development of Black German literary productions. In 1999, Olumide Popula and Beldan Selson published a poetry volume called Talking Home, Heimat aus unserer eigenen Feder, which combines the perspectives of Black Germans and people of color as they come to grips with racial and sexual identity. While this volume continues and intensifies the discourse on queer of color literary production and social critique in Germany, it also shows the transnational affiliations of Black German writers, as well as the Black feminist movement solidary connections with other communities of color in Germany. Another fairly recent poetry compilation, edited by Asoka Esuruoso and Philip Cabo Kapsel, also testifies to those transnational affiliations, but also explores the theme of Afrofuturism that formulates an understanding of the present and the future by taking recourse to the past. As such, the poems in this volume, by, amongst others, Raya Lubinetsky or Chantal Fleur St. John, are preceded by a historical overview of Black German history, as well as a literature survey that highlights literature written by Black people in Germany prior to the movement that eventually took hold in the mid-1980s. Additionally, I would like to highlight the work of Raya Lubinetsky, a Black German poet who grew up in East Germany and, as a contributor to Showing Our Colors, adds this perspective to the mix of the various Afro-German women's voices, as well as a number of selected poems. Describing Lubinetsky's poetic contributions, Christina Pilz notes in her article Poetic Visibility, East German Poetry and Blackness in Farbebekennen that, quote, Lubinetsky interweaves poetic moments of destruction and creation with minority experiences. Her work reveals that Black East German poetry utilizes the potential of poetic expression for effect. Its transformative power is generated by exposing a color blindness in East German society and by giving Black East Germans a presence and a voice, unquote. Apart from that, I would also like to mention the invaluable contributions to the Black German literary scene by Sharon Dodua Otu, who writes fiction in the form of novels and short stories from a Black German perspective. With fictional accounts such as The Things I'm Thinking While Smiling Politely of 2012, a story of identity, love, loss, family, and self-discovery, opens up a new way of writing Black German identity that goes beyond the autobiographical. As such, Sharon Dodua Otu was the first Black German woman to win the Ingeborg Bachmann Literature Award in 2016 for her novel Herr Gottrub setzte sich hin, Herr Gottrub took a seat. In this vein, the last contribution that I would like to mention is another contribution to fictional writing, namely the novel Biskaya, Afropolitana Berlin Roman, Biskaya, Afropolitan Berlin novel, by the queer Black German activist and writer Schwarzhund that was published in 2016 as well. This book depicts the protagonist's, quote, everyday life between diasporic lived reality, psychiatry, and queer families of choice, unquote. Without doubt, Black German authors have gained currency within the German literary market over the past 30 years, dynamically reconfigured the third spaces between margin and center, nation and diaspora, self-identification and external perception, and, ultimately, fact and fiction. I would like to conclude this talk with the words of Maya Yim from her poem, Borderless and Brazen, to which this lecture owes its title. I will go yet another step further and another step, and I will return when I want, if I want, and remain borderless and brazen. Thank you very much for your attention.